A billionaire's empire stood tall, but his body betrayed him in a moment no one could have predicted. It happened during a dazzling charity gala, where lights glittered and glasses clinked in celebration. Cameras flashed, people laughed, and the most powerful man in the room, a billionaire whose name commanded respect, suddenly clutched his chest. At first, the crowd thought it was nothing more than fatigue, perhaps the weight of long speeches and heavy wine. But then he staggered, his knees buckled, and before anyone could process what was happening, the mighty man collapsed to the ground. Gasps echoed. Screams pierced through the ballroom. Doctors rushed in from among the guests. The billionaire had 20 of the world's best medical experts on speed dial, and within minutes they were summoned to his side. Machines were wheeled in, wires connected, and whispers filled the air. He had wealth beyond measure, yet in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. His skin grew pale, his breaths shallow. The gala that was meant to celebrate life and abundance turned into a desperate fight against time. People stood helpless, their sequined dresses and black tuxedos suddenly meaningless in the face of mortality. The 20 doctors worked with precision. Their eyes scanned monitors, their hands injected medicines, their minds calculated possibilities. But something was missing. The tests showed nothing conclusive. One murmured about a rare cardiac condition, another insisted it was neurological, and another suggested toxins. Yet nothing explained the billionaire's rapid decline. The more they tried, the less sense it made. Every treatment failed to bring the stability they promised. His pulse danced dangerously low, and the panic in the room grew heavier than the chandeliers above. What good was money when life itself was slipping away? Across the hospital corridors, far from the grand room where the billionaire lay fighting, another life unfolded quietly. A man in worn shoes pushed a mop bucket, his movements steady though his eyes told a story of sleepless nights. He was a janitor, invisible to most, a shadow in the background of shiny floors and sterile walls. But he was also a single father, raising a little girl who was his entire world. His name rarely mattered to those around him, but to his daughter, he was everything: father, mother, provider, and protector. He had taken the night shift because it paid slightly more, and though the hours were brutal, it allowed him to save a little extra for his daughter's future. Every penny counted. Whether it was for her school supplies, her clothes, or the warm meals he promised she would never miss, even if he went hungry. He lived in a small apartment with cracked walls, but inside that home, laughter bloomed because of the love he poured into it. Tonight, he moved quietly through the hospital halls, pushing his mop with care, humming a tune his daughter loved. To the doctors, nurses, and patients, he was invisible, but he carried stories in his heart. The story of his late wife, who had passed away years earlier after an illness no one could cure, and the story of resilience that pushed him forward every day. He often told his daughter that kindness mattered more than wealth, and that one should never stop looking closely at life. Sometimes, he whispered to her at bedtime, answers hide in places no one bothers to look. As he polished the floor outside the billionaire's room, he overheard fragments of frantic voices. He was used to hearing medical jargon, but tonight the tone was different. There was desperation, a kind of disbelief that even the greatest doctors couldn't mask. He paused for a moment, his mop leaning against the wall, curiosity tugging at him. He wasn't a doctor, not even close, but he knew what fear sounded like. He had heard it in the last breaths of his wife, in the trembling hands of his daughter when she was sick with fever. That same fear now radiated from the billionaire's room. The janitor's heart tightened. He didn't belong in that space. He knew his place was to clean, not to question. Yet something about the scene unfolding nearby drew him in. He glanced through the small glass window and saw the man everyone admired, surrounded by machines and experts, looking more fragile than ever. He saw doctors shaking their heads, scribbling notes, whispering with furrowed brows. The billionaire, despite all his power, looked no different from any other patient gasping for life. The janitor thought of his daughter again. What if it were her lying there and no one could find the answer? Would anyone look deeper? Would anyone care to notice the smallest detail? The thought made him linger, his eyes scanning what little he could see through the glass. Something stirred in his memory, a faint echo of the nights when he sat by his wife's bedside, watching symptoms no doctor noticed until it was too late. He didn't know it yet, but fate was placing him on a path that would blur the lines between janitor and hero. As the night deepened, the hospital seemed divided into two worlds. In one, the richest man was dying despite the brilliance of 20 doctors. In the other, a humble father swept the floors, carrying lessons of loss, love, and persistence in his heart. Soon, those two worlds would collide in a way no one could have imagined, a way that would prove that wisdom doesn't always come from titles or degrees, but sometimes from the quiet eyes of someone who has truly lived through pain. The hours dragged on and the billionaire's condition grew more unstable. The doctors tried treatment after treatment, yet the lines on the monitor refused to steady. Each failed attempt left the room heavier with dread. They whispered about calling in even more specialists, as if adding more titles and degrees could somehow solve the mystery. The billionaire's family stood outside the room, pale and terrified, clutching each other's hands. No amount of money could buy the answer they needed, and every passing second felt like watching sand slip through an hourglass. Meanwhile, the janitor continued his work just outside. His mop slid across the floor, but his attention kept drifting to the glass panel of the door. He couldn't help noticing the billionaire's shallow breaths, the way his chest seemed to fight with every rise and fall. Something about the rhythm tugged at him, sparking an old memory. Years ago, when his wife was sick, he had sat by her side for nights without rest. He had memorized the smallest details of her breathing, her skin color, the way her body reacted to medication. He remembered once pointing out a subtle change that the doctor had overlooked until later. That memory now stirred restlessly inside him, urging him not to turn away. He pushed his mop aside and stood still, his eyes locked on the billionaire through the glass. The doctors inside debated, some raising their voices, others shaking their heads. To them, he was invisible, just a worker in overalls, but he saw something they didn't. The billionaire's lips carried a faint discoloration, not quite the usual signs of a heart condition but something else. Something that reminded him of the rare reaction his wife had suffered from when given a particular type of medication. His heart pounded. Could it be the same? Could all these brilliant doctors have missed what his own grief had taught him years ago? The janitor's instinct told him he was right, but who would listen? He hesitated, torn between fear and duty. Speaking up could cost him his job, even his dignity. Yet staying silent could mean the death of a man whose life hung by a thread. He took a deep breath and gently tapped on the door. No one paid attention. He tapped again, louder this time, until one doctor turned with irritation. "What is it? Can't you see this is critical?" The man snapped. The janitor lowered his eyes respectfully. I noticed something," he said quietly, his voice trembling. His lips, the way they're changing color. "My wife once had the same reaction to a medicine. It wasn't her heart at all, it was the medication. Please, check if he's reacting badly to what you gave him." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted with scoffs. "You're not a doctor," one muttered. "Get back to your work," another said sharply. A nurse tried to shoo him away, embarrassed. Heat rushed to his face, shame battling with conviction, but he couldn't leave. He knew what he had seen. He swallowed his fear and tried again. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "I don't mean to interfere. But if I'm right, he doesn't need more medicine, he needs that one stopped." The doctors dismissed him, turning back to their monitors, their egos unwilling to bend to the word of a janitor. But one younger doctor lingered, watching the janitor's eyes. There was no arrogance there, no desire for recognition, only a desperate sincerity. Something about that look gave the young doctor pause. When the billionaire's vitals dropped again, panic spiking through the room, the young doctor finally spoke. "What if he's right? What if it's an adverse reaction? We've tried everything else." The others resisted. "You'd take advice from a janitor." One sneered. But the billionaire's pulse was crashing fast, and the clock was merciless. The young doctor made a quick decision. "We're running out of time. Stop the medication now." The nurses froze, unsure, but the command in his voice pushed them into action. The drip was halted. Seconds felt like years as everyone's eyes fixed on the monitors. At first, nothing changed. Doubt filled the air. Then, slowly, the rhythm of the billionaire's breathing began to ease. The lines on the monitor steadied, faint but undeniable. Gasps of disbelief spread across the room. The billionaire's chest rose with a more natural rhythm, and a faint flush returned to his cheeks. The transformation was small, fragile, but it was there. Hope bloomed where despair had rooted itself. The doctors looked at one another in stunned silence, their certainty shaken. For the first time in hours, the impossible seemed possible again. The young doctor turned toward the door where the janitor stood. Their eyes met through the glass. The janitor wasn't smiling. His face was filled with quiet relief, as though he had just done what he felt any human should. But inside, his heart raced. He had risked everything, his job, his pride, to speak up. And now, it seemed, he had been right. Inside the room, whispers turned into murmurs of awe. The billionaire was stabilizing. The nurses double-checked the monitors, almost unwilling to believe what they were seeing. A man who had been minutes from death was now breathing easier, all because someone without a degree had noticed what they had missed. The janitor stepped back, trying to disappear into the background again. But it was too late. The seed of truth had been planted, and soon, everyone would know that the life of one of the world's most powerful men had been saved not by 20 of the finest doctors, but by the quiet eyes of a single father who carried love and loss deep in his heart. The billionaire's eyes fluttered open slowly, the beeping of the monitors steadying into a rhythm that filled the room with cautious relief. His voice was faint, almost a whisper, but strong enough to silence everyone. "What happened?" he asked, struggling to focus on the faces surrounding him. The doctors exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to answer. They had spent hours working, testing, guessing, failing, yet the turning point hadn't come from them. It had come from the one man they had dismissed. The young doctor finally stepped forward. "Sir, there was a reaction to the medicine. We stopped it in time. You're stable now." His words were careful, but his eyes flicked toward the doorway where the janitor stood quietly, half hidden in the shadow of the hall. The billionaire followed the glance and saw him. For a moment, confusion clouded his expression. Why was a janitor standing among the whispers of life and death? Then the memory sharpened. He remembered hearing a voice, not one of authority, but one filled with raw sincerity, urging them to stop. "Who saved me?" the billionaire asked, his voice rasping. Silence hung in the air like a heavy curtain. No one wanted to admit it. The room of 20 experts, each armed with degrees and reputations, stood frozen in pride. It was the young doctor who finally broke the silence. "It was him," he said softly, nodding toward the janitor. All eyes turned. The janitor shifted uncomfortably, gripping the handle of his mop like it was a shield. His uniform was worn, his shoes scuffed, his face tired from years of sacrifice, yet in that moment, he looked like the most significant man in the room. The billionaire blinked, disbelief etched into his face. "A janitor," he murmured. His voice carried no mockery, only astonishment. The janitor lowered his gaze. "I just noticed something the others didn't," he said humbly. "My wife once had the same reaction. I didn't want to interfere, but I couldn't stay silent." His words trembled, yet the honesty in them was undeniable. The billionaire stared at him, his chest rising with steadier breaths. He had built empires, commanded respect, and surrounded himself with the best money could buy, yet in his darkest hour, it wasn't wealth or status that pulled him back from the edge. It was a man most people overlooked, a father working quietly in the shadows to give his daughter a better life. The realization struck him harder than any illness. Tears welled in his eyes, something his boardrooms and private jets had never seen. Days passed, and the news spread like wildfire. The story of the billionaire who 20 doctors couldn't save, but a janitor did, traveled beyond hospital walls. People whispered about it in cafes, shared it in newsrooms, and posted it on social media. Some called it luck, others called it fate, but everyone agreed it was extraordinary. For the janitor, life returned to its rhythm, early mornings with his daughter, long nights with his mop, but something had shifted. He no longer walked invisible. Nurses nodded respectfully, doctors who once brushed past him now stopped to greet him, and strangers whispered his story in the halls. One evening, as he finished his shift, he found a man waiting for him by the hospital entrance. It was the billionaire, no longer pale and weak but dressed sharply, though still carrying the humility of someone who had faced death. Behind him stood security guards, but he waved them back. "I needed to see you," the billionaire said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You didn't just save my life. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life is not about power or wealth, but about humanity." The janitor shifted nervously, "I only did what anyone should have done," he replied. The billionaire shook his head firmly. "No, others stayed silent. You spoke up. You risked being humiliated, even losing your job, just to do what was right. That, courage, that's worth more than anything I own." The janitor's daughter, who had been waiting by his side holding his hand, looked up at the billionaire with wide eyes. The billionaire knelt down, meeting her gaze with a gentleness that few had ever seen from him. "You must be very proud of your father," he said softly. The little girl smiled shyly, her grip tightening on her father's hand. The billionaire stood again, pulling out an envelope. "I want to give you something," he said. The janitor shook his head quickly. "I don't need money. Please, I didn't do this for a reward." But the billionaire pressed the envelope into his hand. "This isn't just money, it's opportunity. Inside is a scholarship for your daughter, her education, her future, everything she needs to become whatever she dreams of. No father who sacrifices as much as you should have to worry about whether his child will have a chance." The janitor's eyes filled with tears. For years, he had scrubbed floors and carried the weight of two parents on his shoulders. He had whispered promises to his daughter at night, unsure how he would ever keep them. Now, fate had answered in a way he never imagined. He hugged his daughter close, his heart swelling with gratitude. The billionaire extended his hand. "And as for me," he said, "I want you to know you'll never be invisible again. You taught me more in one night than all the experts I've ever known. You gave me back my life. I intend to live it differently, thanks to you." In that moment, two men from opposite worlds stood together, one who had everything but almost lost it all, and one who had nothing but gave everything he had. The climax of their story wasn't just about a life saved. It was about humanity rediscovered, about courage and compassion proving stronger than pride. As they parted, the janitor whispered to his daughter, "See. Sometimes the smallest voices can make the biggest difference." And she, smiling with the innocence of a child who believed in her father as a hero, replied, "I always knew you could." The story spread across the world, leaving millions inspired. In boardrooms and in kitchens, people repeated its message: greatness doesn't always wear a suit or carry a title. Sometimes, it carries a mop and a heart brave enough to care.